Hi guys, Ricky Pope here, and this week on the Christian Nerds Unite podcast, I talk with Christiana Hale, author of Deeper Heaven, a reader's guide to C.S. Lewis's Ransom Trilogy, sometimes referred to as the Space Trilogy. Plus, scripture and nerdy news, and we'll get to all of that right after this.
Hey guys, this is Ashley Cox from Fangirling Over Jesus. At FOJ, we believe in hope and light in the darkness and that you are not alone. We seek to unite and celebrate the intersection of the gospel and our favorite fandoms, and we get to do this through our social media, our podcast devotional, and our cosplay and fashion. And you can find links to all of that through our website, www.fangirlingoverjesus.com, through our social media at Fangirlingoverjesus, wherever you get your podcasts, and on Etsy. See you online.
And lead me on to your kingdom come, surrendering, let your work be done. My life I give for the glory of your Son.
Thanks so much for listening to the Christian Nerds Unite podcast every week. Recently, we helped launch the Christian Nerd HQ podcast network. The network releases content every weekday. Christian Nerds Unite on Mondays, Tatooine Sons with David Jesse and his sons BB Nate and Samuel the Hutt on Tuesdays, Fangirling Over Jesus with Ashley Cox on Wednesdays, the Reverend and the Reprobate with Lucas and Danley on Thursdays, and the Speaking Nerdy podcast every Friday with host Mike Schilling and myself. Go check out ChristianNerdHQ.com to follow all the podcasts and check out the Christian Nerd HQ YouTube channel for even more exclusive content we're creating together. Let's start with some scripture. Let's read Psalm 8. Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You have set your glory in the heavens. Through the praise of children and infants, you have established a stronghold against your enemies, to silence the foe and the avenger. When I consider your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you've set in place, what is mankind that you are mindful of them? Human beings that you care for them. You have made them a little lower than the angels and crowned them with glory and honor. You have made them rulers over the works of your hands. You put everything under their feet, all flocks and herds, and the animals of the wild, the birds in the sky and the fish in the sea, all that swim the paths of the seas. Lord, our Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. John 1 speaks of Jesus as the Word, saying that the Word was with God and the Word was God, and that nothing was made that was made without him. So Jesus made everything we can see, a huge universe, and we're just a speck compared to that. But he still cares about us so much that he came down to give his life for us. It's amazing. I pray that you'll take a moment this week to step outside and view the heavens and the stars and consider everything that God has created. Let's get into some nerdy news. This weekend was the biggest box office weekend since April 2019, the weekend when Avengers Endgame released. The Barbie movie takes first place this weekend with over $155 million domestically and $337 million worldwide, the largest Warner Brothers opening since Batman v Superman. Oppenheimer came in second at $80 million domestically and $174 million worldwide. The Sound of Freedom rounded out the top three, adding another $20 million, bringing it to a new total of $124 million for this small budget faith-based film. The SAG-AFTRA Actors Union has gone on strike. Now with actors and writers on strike, most productions have completely shut down. Along with not being able to shoot scenes, actors are also not allowed to promote work they've already completed. So upcoming film releases will likely be promoted by producers and directors. It has been over 60 years since writers and actors both went on strike at the same time. Some are suggesting that negotiations will not begin again until mid-fall. NBC and CBS have both already released their fall schedules loaded with competition shows, reruns, and a few selected new seasons that were already complete, since they are not going to be able to produce any new content before this agreement happens. 39 truly independent productions have received waivers to continue shooting during the strike. This includes The Chosen, a faith-based series following the life of Jesus. This one received a waiver primarily because it is fully independently funded. All these productions provided paperwork to SAG-AFTRA confirming that they do not have any association to the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers, who are in conflict with the Writers and the Actors Guilds. Some productions located in the UK that are covered by the UK Equity Union can also continue because of some specific and pretty complicated British laws that I'm not going to get into. House of the Dragon is one such production that will continue. This week, I chatted with Christiana Hale, writer of Deeper Heaven, a reader's guide to C.S. Lewis's Ransom Trilogy. Now, you may be more familiar with this C.S. Lewis series being called the Space Trilogy. Christiana has taken a very deep dive into the series and brings out a lot of ideas that you may not have realized. So let's get right into our interview. Christiana Hale, it is so great to have you on the Christian Nerd Unite podcast today.
Thank you for having me on. I'm excited about this.
I am too. I have been trying to find a good guest to talk about C.S. Lewis's Space Trilogy for quite some time, and you were one of the names that came up in conversations. So I have wanted to talk to you for quite some time. Tell us just really quick, who is Christiana Hale, and what are you kind of known for?
Well, definitely being a C.S. Lewis nerd. that's for sure. No, so I primarily I'm a teacher. Actually, I'm a literature and Latin teacher, which is kind of unusual, I suppose. But I grew up on C.S. Lewis, primarily the Chronicles of Narnia, and just grew up knowing him for that and loving those books. And I discovered more of his literature, more of his works in college, and just especially the Ransom Trilogy, or the Space Trilogy as it's commonly called. I don't know, it just was one of those series that just spoke to me, right? It caught my attention. I fell in love with it. I also had some different college professors that were really, really engaging and loved that book. And so that inspired me as well. And it was one of those kind of just snowball effect, how I got into where I am now and talking to you about the book that I wrote was kind of just like, well, I was really interested in those books. I wrote my undergrad thesis on those books. In the course of that research, I realized there's not a whole lot out there at the time, at least. There's definitely more now than there used to be. But this was back in, closing on 10 years ago now. There wasn't as much out there on the Ransom Trilogy, on Space Trilogy. And so as I was writing more of this research project, it was kind of an argumentative thesis. I just kept running into question after question, especially from friends back home or from, my parents' friends, like homeschool parents and things, just saying, why are you writing on the Space Trilogy? It's such a weird, it's so weird. Like that was the common statement. Like, it's so weird. I don't get it. And
They're not wrong.
They're not wrong. They're not wrong. And I kept finding myself wanting to be able to point them somewhere and say, well, go read this book. This will help you. And there's definitely were some good books out there at the time, but nothing that really nailed the audience that I was thinking of in particular. There were some very scholarly works that were really excellent, but I was thinking a homeschool mom isn't going to have time to read this, or it isn't even necessarily hitting the things that I wish would be hit. And so when it came time, I continued on to grad school and was working on thinking of a graduate thesis project. I thought, well, why don't I just take all this research I've already done and try to answer those questions that I kept getting, which is why the Ransom Trilogy? Like, why the Space Trilogy? What's the point? How can I give people handles with which to, hold on to this and hopefully, at least if not fall in love with it, at least have an appreciation for what Lewis was trying to do, and hopefully make a little more sense of it. And so that's how my book Deeper Heaven was born. It was originally meant to just fill a hole that I thought needed to be filled. and since then there's been more books written about it, which I think is great. I think it's getting a lot more attention in recent years that is well deserved, I believe, because I do believe that it's really just an excellent trilogy in many ways. And particularly the third book is very prophetic, and Lewis shows a lot of wisdom and insight into the nature of humanity and the world, and just everything. There's a lot of things that happen in that book. They're like, oh, wow, this was written. When was this written? 50 years ago. And yeah, that he hits the nail on the head a lot of times with what he has to say. So anyway, that's kind of, I guess I kind of rambled on a little bit, but a short story, sort of how I came to be where I am and how the book came to be as well.
Awesome. Well, let's kind of deal with the big elephant in the room. I for those of you who are listening on a podcast app, I put air quotes around it when I said Space Trilogy, and you have thrown out the term Ransom Trilogy or Space Trilogy. You've used both terms, but so that is actually a big issue with this particular trilogy. What exactly is it? So why do you think that has been such a confusing part of this whole series?
Yeah, so I think part of it is, honestly, the more that I research and learn about the trilogy, I think it does kind of defy categorization, and that does throw people, because especially the first book, Lewis has so the main character of the trilogy, his name is Ransom, which is where the term Ransom Trilogy came from. So Lewis himself doesn't ever really give it a name. So the trilogy doesn't have a name that's been given to it by the author. So he refers to it sometimes as his cosmic stories. He also says space. He does say space stories at some point. So as a side note, I don't think Lewis himself would be too upset that people are calling it the Space Trilogy. He himself wasn't too pedantic about that sort of thing. I think he'd find it amusing and ironic, if anything, right? He'd kind of chuckle about it. So I will often refer to it as the Space Trilogy because most people know it as that. And it's not wrong necessarily. But the more we dig into, I think, why one of the purposes for Lewis's writing this trilogy, I think it does make more sense to call it something else. So I can talk more on that in a minute. But so when in the first book, though, I think one of the reasons that is commonly called the Space Trilogy is the first book does lead you to expect more of what we typically think of when we say science fiction, because Ransom, the main character, goes up into what he thinks of as space at the time. Yeah. And he goes up in a spaceship
of
sorts, right? Lewis does. And Lewis does have one of the characters kind of sort of try to explain some of the science behind the physics of how this spaceship works. And I think Lewis actually in a letter later on realizes that actually wasn't maybe the best thing, because the science was really beyond him. Like, he's not a scientist. He doesn't know how it works. And he's writing at a time when, we're taking steps towards actual space travel. And so he saw the obsolescence of whatever he did coming. He's like, whatever I do to get Ransom into space, onto another planet, is going to be totally ridiculous in the next 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, right? He saw that. And so by the second book, what he does to get Ransom into another planet is he just has the angels do it. Just
Yeah.
like, we're just going to have it be, it's more fantasy. It starts to feel more like fantasy and less like
Yes.
science fiction. And so the first book is probably the most
Yeah.
sci-fi of the three.
And then
So
the third book is pretty much earthbound.
yeah.
So yeah, that is, I have come from a background of loving classic sci-fi novels, especially what people consider hard sci-fi.
Mm,
So where they talk about, how things work, how things operate, where the authors do that scientific research and come
mhm.
up with their best conjecture of how things work or could work. So I love things like Starship Troopers, the novel from the 50s, and some books like that. So when I came into the Space Trilogy, I kind of envisioned that kind of setting. And I did have exactly those kind of uh, issues
Mhm.
with, reading through his attempted description of how this spaceship, quote unquote spaceship, that's more like a coffin than anything
Yeah.
else.
Yeah.
I'm like, okay. And then the next book, we just ignore that completely. And
Mhm.
then the third book, it doesn't have anything to do with space, but does kind of revolve around the ideas he's learned through the
Mhm.
last two books. So I think that has been a struggle for me to really enjoy this series the way I had
Mhm.
hoped I would, because I do love I do love C.S. Lewis. I think if I had come at it like you were saying, that it's a little more on the fantasy side
Mhm.
than the sci-fi side, I think maybe I would have enjoyed it more. And I've read it
Yeah.
2 or 3 times, so I know the way it works. But I think having that understanding would have been
Mhm.
better for me before I started reading it.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of understanding, you talk a lot in your book, Deeper Heaven, that C.S. Lewis has this vision of, he's using the ideas of medieval cosmology when he's telling this story, which is a different way of thinking about the world. And you also talk about materialism
Mhm.
being kind of the juxtaposition there. And for those who are listening, who, when you think of materialism, you think of money, or you think of owning stuff.
Mhm.
That's not exactly the kind of materialism we're talking about here. We're talking about the idea that things are, rather than things being spiritual, they're being physical and
Mhm.
made of physical matter. So, but talk to us a little bit about why understanding that idea of medieval cosmology will help us get a better feel for what Lewis
Mhm.
is trying to communicate in this series.
Yeah, so I think the important thing, what Lewis does really well, and I think what he understands the medieval cosmology does well, is what also is not just fighting against materialism. Lewis was fighting against that idea because that was the pendulum swing that he saw
Mm,
our culture heading towards, right?
mhm.
Materialism on one side, which says that, like you mentioned, all reality only consists of the material. So
Right.
it's less, you can call someone a materialist in just the casual sense, in that, oh, all you care about is just stuff, right? But this
Yeah.
is more of an idea of an entire worldview, of philosophy of, right, what is
That
reality?
everything can
Reality
be
is
explained.
just
Yeah, everything
in
can be
terms of the
explained
physical.
in terms of the physical, and
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
definitely what he pushes against
Yes.
in this
And
series.
yes, and for sure. And the other pendulum swing would be more of kind of a Gnosticism, which denies the importance of the physical reality and purely focuses on the spiritual, right? And that our
Mm,
goal, this is kind of leaning more towards like Platonism, those sorts of ideas where the physical is just we're kind of bound by it right now, but our goal, our ultimate aim is to be purely spiritual, right?
mhm.
Beings, like just shed the physicality, right? And Lewis is trying to do something in between, right? He's trying to, there's something in the middle. There's not, our goal is, we're spiritual and physical beings. And that's been the Christian idea
Yes.
for forever, right? That God created us to be physical beings, but we're obviously created also in his image. So,
Yes.
so we are not just body and we're not just soul, we're soul, spirit, and body. And so that idea that I think Lewis saw the medievals as really having a firm grasp on. The cosmology, the idea, the kind of map of the universe that they had in their minds was an organization and a structure that leaned into both of those realities. So it is a very physical structure. It has a lot of weight and matter to it. But it's a structure that also is filled with personality and life and spirit and things that we can't always understand or explain in terms of just the physical. So I think that is what Lewis was really fascinated with about the medieval cosmology, and the thing that he really takes a hold of and infuses into the trilogy in a really amazing way. So we never get the sense that the goal is just to, escape the physical realm. So even though he's fighting against materialism, he doesn't swing into, therefore, since we're arguing against the idea that everything is matter, we therefore have to say that matter is bad. That's not, or deny matter, right? That he's not swinging the other direction. He's saying, no, we have to recognize that the reason matter and the physical world matters, to kind of play on words there. The reason it matters, the reason the physical world is important is because of the spiritual reality, because it's not just matter. There's more to it than that, because it's been created and therefore it is important. It has importance, and we can actually care about it. So just skipping ahead a little bit to the third book, but in the third book, the kind of the enemy of the third book is this organization called the NICE. And one of their goals is to just strip everything of organic matter, actually, and kind of recreate the world into just this metallic, mechanistic place. And they're also saying that they deny the spiritual reality, and yet they're taking their orders from these dark spirits. And it's very weird. It's like you're contradiction all over the place. And so that's a really good example of how Lewis is pushing against that. He's like, we don't push against that by a rejection of the physical. We push against it by knowing what the physical world is for, and knowing what its place is, and how to treat it the way that we ought to. And so in the third book, again, you see lots of animals and lots of nature and that sort of thing coming up and coming into play. And yeah, it's just great the way he utilizes it. So that he gets a lot of those ideas from the way the medieval mindset would see the heavens, see space. And so that kind of leads back to your first question about space, right? Why do we kind of fight against this being called the Space Trilogy? Well, Lewis in the end of the first book even says that one of the purposes would be to get his readers thinking more in terms of the heavens and less in terms of space, right? Return to seeing the fact that the heavens declare the glory of God. There's more to it than just balls of burning gas, as Eustace Clarence Scrub says in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, right? Maybe that's what they're made of, but that's not all they are, right? There is more going on than just the physical. So hopefully that answered your question a little bit.
No, I think it does. So now, there are 3 books. So let's just kind of briefly go through the 3 books. So we have Out of the Silent Planet as the first novel. And now the first novel is mostly set on Mars. And so some people might get the idea that the Silent Planet is Mars, but that's not actually accurate. Tell us a little bit about that in that first novel.
So the key is in the title, right? It's called Out of the Silent Planet, and Ransom leaves Earth to go to Mars. So he's actually leaving the Silent Planet to go to Mars. So Earth is actually in Lewis's terms, he names it Thulcandra, and Thulk means silent. So it's the silent planet. Why is it the silent planet? Well, this is, again, he borrows a little bit from medieval cosmology and then takes it and expands it in his fictional universe that he's creating. So in medieval cosmology, the idea is that it is a geocentric cosmos.
Right.
So the Earth is at the center, with all of the planets then revolving around or spinning around Earth. And as you work your way out, the moon is the first planet that you would get to outside. They consider it a planet. It is called the moon, but they consider it one of the planets in their terminology. So that's the first level, you might say. And in medieval cosmology, their idea was that everything below the moon was fallen and affected by sin and the fall of man. And everything past the moon is called the translunar realm. So trans just means across, lunar, across the moon, obviously. So there's a translunar boundary, and everything above that boundary would be pure and unfallen, and not affected by man's sin. And so that was the medieval conception. And Lewis kind of takes that idea and then runs with it. He has some fun with it and says, so not only is that true, but there's also this kind of unspoken law that nothing can go past that boundary one way or the other. So so none of the angelic beings are actually really allowed to come down to Earth, or at least the big A angelic beings, right? There are some other spirits that can come down, but the angelic beings associated with each planet can't transgress that boundary. Man is not meant to transgress that boundary. And so what happens is he kind of makes this a plot point in the book. So in the first book, Ransom, the character, is kidnapped by a couple of men who have already actually gone to Mars. So they've gone up in their spaceship. They've made it to Mars. And they did not understand a word that the natives were saying. They didn't understand the language. They didn't know what was going on. And they somehow got the idea that the natives of the planet Mars wanted a sacrifice. They wanted a human sacrifice. And so they came back to Earth to kidnap someone, to take back, to hand over to the natives, because of course they weren't going to give themselves up. So that's how Ransom gets kidnapped and taken up to Mars, and then he has his adventures there, primarily consisting of just getting to know these creatures that are living on the planet. He learns the language that they are speaking. It's called Old Solar, and in so doing, they've broken that law, though. So what's fascinating, what makes Lewis such a great storyteller is that comes back to play later, right? So the whole story starts out with these men have broken that law. They've broken through that boundary, and once you've broken through, a door works both ways, right? Once you've opened a door, yes, you can go out, but other things can come in, right?
Yes.
So that comes back to, comes into play in both the second and third book. Second book, the reason that the second book happens, Perelandra, is that Ransom knows the language, Old Solar now. He knows how, he's the only human, at least at this point, who knows that language, the language of deep heaven. And so he is chosen, he's given this task to accomplish on Venus. And in that one, again, the angels take him up there. They give him this little like coffin-y sort of a ship to, like, it's not really a ship, it's just a container, basically. It's like, here's a container for you to lie in while we take you up to Venus. And so that is connected, though, to the first book. Why was Ransom chosen? Well, it's just because he was kidnapped and learned the language while he was on Mars. So he gets to be taken up. And then obviously the third book, the culmination of the series, I kind of hinted at this earlier. Again, a door lets things in as well as letting things out. So that comes to play. I won't too many spoilers, right? We don't want too many spoilers. But that is important.
Let's be honest. The book is like 70 years old. I think we're past the spoiler point.
A lot of people haven't read it, though.
That is true. Now you said something interesting that I think was a bit of a slip of the tongue, but I did want to address and ask this question. So Ransom is a philologist, somebody who
Mm.
studies languages. So it's convenient that the guy that they kidnapped happens to be the kind of person who could learn a language.
Mhm.
Um, and a slip of the tongue, you briefly said Lewis goes, and then you said, I mean,
Yep.
Ransom goes.
Mhm.
Um, do you feel like, and I don't know that I've read this anywhere, but I've always felt like Lewis kind of wrote himself into this story as Ransom. Do you
Mhm.
think is that a thing, or is that?
I think a little bit. So what's interesting is that Lewis does actually truly write himself into the story. So in the end of Out of the
That
Silent
is true.
Planet, he
Yes.
has Ransom writing a letter to him, and then at the beginning of Perelandra, he actually writes in first person for a bit as the character Lewis going to meet Ransom, and he has a whole conversation with
Yes.
Ransom as a character in the story. So there's that. I think there is a theory that Ransom was somewhat based off of J.R.R. Tolkien, who
Okay.
was a good friend of Lewis's, who was himself actually a philologist. Lewis was very interested in languages, but he wasn't technically a philologist. He was a
Gotcha.
professor of literature. Tolkien, however, was a philologist. So, and the whole thing sort of started, or the seeds of it were sown when the two of them were having a conversation about kind of bemoaning and complaining about the lack of the kinds of stories they liked. Like, there's just not enough stories that we like. So maybe we should write some more. Like, let's write some more stories. And so there was this sort of challenge that Lewis would write a space travel story and Tolkien would write a time travel story. And Tolkien actually did start a time travel story, but in typical Tolkien fashion, he didn't finish it because he was probably being too much of a perfectionist, maybe. I don't know. But of course, then in typical Lewis fashion, he didn't just write a space travel story. He wrote a trilogy, full length, book length, 3 books, so he kind of took a little farther. So there is some theory that Ransom is at least somewhat based off of Tolkien himself, as sort of a nod or an acknowledgement to that. I think very quickly, though, you do see just his personality takes on his own character, his own personality. And as with any character that an author writes, it's always, of course, there are elements that are Lewis, right? Because Lewis is the author, Lewis the writer. I don't know that he was 100% consciously writing Ransom if it was himself. But there's definitely some similarities and elements that are, especially at the beginning, the first book, more than others, I believe. In the second and third book is when he kind of starts his trajectory, his journey has gone on such a different path that he really becomes his own sort of entity, right? So but that was a good question. So yeah, I definitely think there's some similarities there, though, for sure.
Now, in the second book, we come to Perelandra, which is Venus, and now in that book, we kind of get a bit of an Adam and Eve kind of thing going on. Tell us a little bit about that particular one, and what's the main focus there.
So yes, I do think it's meant to be sort of an Eden, paradise lost sort of retelling. But Lewis is very conscious, I think, and Ransom even has this thought to himself. He's very conscious to not say, well, this is just an exact blow by blow retelling of the Garden of Eden story and the fall of man, and if it had happened on Venus, right? There's some this is the story of the potential fall of this world, but this planet, Venus, but it's different because it's happening in a world that Christ has come into, right? So we live in a cosmos, a universe where Christ has been born. He was incarnated. He died and he rose again. And that has happened. That's happened in the middle of history. And that changes things, right? So the fact of that means that whatever happens on Venus, it's not going to be the exact same story. It can't be the exact same story.
Right.
And Ransom kind of wonders that to himself. Like, what if I fail in this task that I have been given? Well, whatever happens is going to be amazing, right? God will redeem this world too. It won't look the same. I have no idea what it will look like because it's a new story. It's not the same story, but the parallels are very clear, right? You have man and the woman who are the only inhabitants of this world, and the Eve character it's interesting. She's been separated from her husband, so they're not actually together for the majority of the book. And so Ransom, in a sense, is sort of this Adam-like character because it's his job to try to stand between her and the serpent character, which is kind of it's a man from the first book. His name's Weston, but he's been possessed by the devil, and so he's kind of the serpent character trying to tempt Eve, the Eve character. And so Ransom is sort of this odd in between, go between, right? He's trying to protect her from that, but he also is trying to protect her in a way, like keep her from doing it, try to convince her that this is not what you should do. So it's a very interesting book in that there's a lot of conversation throughout. Like, a lot of the book for the majority is just a lot of different conversations that are had between Ransom and the Eve character, between Ransom and the devil character, between all three of them, and there's lots of talking conversations, and it really is fascinating. Lewis was clearly very inspired by Milton's Paradise Lost as well, though there's a lot of imagery that he draws from there, and the setting itself on Venus is just a beautiful setting. He does pulls out all the stops on the description on this book, which makes sense. It's the planet named after the goddess of love and beauty. And so he really just draws that out in the way he describes the physical nature of the planet as well. So that's kind of the arc of the book, or at least the hook of the book. It's probably personally my favorite one, even though I think, probably more for personal reasons, I just found it really striking when I read it. There were a lot of things that were that I still just go back to whenever I think about it. So whenever I'm pressed, I have to say that Perelandra is my favorite, though I love all of them, so it's very hard to pick a favorite.
Now, kind of the bad guy, for lack of a better term, we have Weston, who appears in the first two books. And then we talk about, Ransom. He's kind of the hero, the person we follow. And Ransom has kind of an interesting name, but we do kind of have this Ransom as kind of a Christ figure, and Weston is kind of, the Satan figure, trying to battle it out. But we even have a more direct Christian analogy, where we have, that where Ransom actually hits Weston in the head with a rock, crushing his head, but Weston injures Ransom's heel. So we have that that almost direct, which is kind of a very Lewis kind of thing. Tolkien is famous for saying he doesn't like things that are, that blatantly obvious. But even though he has some things that are pretty blatantly obvious, but Lewis was not ashamed of doing things that was like, oh yeah, this is absolutely an allusion to a biblical passage. I'm not even going to try to hide that fact.
Yes, that's probably honestly one of my favorite scenes, actually, is when Ransom picks up the rock, and I love it. He just says, "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, here goes." And that's my favorite. That's my favorite line. I don't know. Every time it makes me laugh. It makes me chuckle. But yes, and it is amazing, though. I mean, we say it's obvious, but it is actually missed by a lot of people, a lot of readers. So, I mean, and part of that is perhaps depending on your level of biblical literacy, right? Being familiar with that story. I mean, for us, as soon as you hear oh, he crushes his head and his heel is injured. Like, there it is, right? The head and heel, like as soon as you hear that.
Yeah.
But it can actually be missed sometimes. But that it is really important, especially I think leading into the third book, because Ransom very clearly has a sort of a Christ figure role to play in the third book, even though he's not, at first it doesn't seem like he's as present in the third book. So that I know we're kind of getting into the last book of the trilogy here, but the third book actually kind of refocuses the main characters. There's a married couple, Mark and
Yeah, I was
Jane.
going to say, let's go ahead and go into that. So
Yeah.
that Hideous Strength is the name of the third book. And it is completely different in my brain than either of the other two. Weston is no longer involved. So we've lost the guy that we've thought of as the bad guy for the last two books. We have a whole new group of people. And Ransom kind of takes a different role. And he is a major character and he's super important, but he's not exactly who we follow.
Yeah, he's gone. He's kind of stepped into more of a background, secondary in terms of where we as the readers are tracking, right? So
Yes.
He's definitely very important, but we are following along with different characters now. I will say that so from the very first book, the two men that kidnap Ransom are Weston and Divine. Weston, as you mentioned, he dies at the end of Perelandra. So,
Right.
I argue that he dies much sooner than that when the devil like fully takes over him. So really, Ransom kills the devil, but that's another thing. But Divine from the first book actually is Lord Feverstone in the third book. So he does come back. So there is sort of this thread of, even though Weston is gone, Weston's ideas, his philosophies, his vision for reality are still well and alive in the NICE through Lord Feverstone and through the other people that are clearly still proponents of Weston's ideologies, right? So it's still the same enemy in a way. It just looks different. It's in a different form. It's definitely more of an organization, less one man. And so it does feel and look very, very
and an organization that you instantly know is evil because it's named Nice.
Yes. Yeah, like, I have a feeling this is not accurate.
That is one of those that is one of those things where I read Lewis and I'm like, really we're gonna go there. Okay, we're gonna go there. All right,
all
right, let's go.
There actually is, you could Google it, there is an organization in England that's the acronym is NICE. It's known as the NICE. So I believe it began after Lewis wrote this book, but it's not. It still is there. It's existent today. So it's something funny. About. I can't remember what it stands for exactly, but there is, and you think you guys need to read more books if you think that's a good name for your. It's been ruined forever.
Oh my
Lewis.
Goodness!
So
it was great getting to know Christiana. We talked a long time, so I decided to split this one up into 2 episodes. Make sure you listen next week to part 2 and check out the links in the show notes below to follow Christiana. Well, that's all I have for you today. Don't forget to like, subscribe, follow, just click all those links, whatever the links are down there, so you can keep up with the new content as we release it. You'll find all of our social links and links to our YouTube channel and to our online store at ChristianNerdsUnite.com. If you enjoy the show and want to help even more, consider becoming a supporter on Patreon. We have some exciting Patreon option levels, and every level has great benefits that make a huge difference in the ministry we're able to do. Supporters will also get to hear exclusive stories of believers we're serving around the world through our ministry partners. To check it out or partner with us, go to patreon.com/ChristianNerdsUnite or ChristianNerdsUnite.com and click support in the menu. And don't forget to check out ChristianNerdHQ.com for more great podcasts. Before you go, I do want to leave you with this blessing from Hebrews 13. Now may the God of peace, who through the blood of the eternal covenant brought back from the dead our Lord Jesus, that great shepherd of the sheep, equip you with everything good for doing his will, and may he work in us what is pleasing to him through Jesus Christ, to whom be glory forever and ever. Amen. We'll see you next week. Blessings.
Hey